February 23, 1946, a Japanese general who had humiliated the British Empire in Singapore was led to the gallows in the Philippines. Tomoyuki Yamashita, known as the Tiger of Malaya, went from being the most feared strategist in Southeast Asia to a prisoner convicted of war crimes. His rise had been meteoric, his fall relentless. The trial in Manila sought not only a culprit, but a precedent. Yamashita was not accused of giving direct orders, but of failing to prevent atrocities committed under his command. The Manila massacre, with more than 100,000 civilians killed, was the central argument to declare that a commander must be held accountable for the crimes of his troops, even if he claimed ignorance. How did a military hero end up hanged as a criminal? Was it justice or revenge? What did the end of the Tiger of Malaya really mean for the history of modern warfare? Forge of Steel, birth of the Tiger of Malaya. Tomoyuki Yamashita was born on November 8, 1885 in Otoyo, a rural village in Kochi Prefecture on Shikoku. His father worked as a local doctor, placing the family in the respectable middle class of Meiji-era Japan. The country had just demonstrated its military capability by defeating China in 1894 and Russia in 1905, convincing his generation that military service represented the path to national honor. In 1905, at the age of 20, he entered the Imperial Army Academy in Tokyo. He graduated that same year, ranking 16th out of 920 cadets of the 18th class. This placement positioned him among the elite of the officer corps and virtually guaranteed a promising military career. Academic records describe a meticulous cadet with particular talent for strategy. His instructors noted his ability to solve complex problems in a practical manner, a trait that distinguished him from peers who prioritized patriotic fervor over cold analysis. After graduation, he was assigned to the 11th Infantry Regiment in Hiroshima. In 1916, during the First World War, he took part in minor operations against German positions in Shandong, China. This experience revealed to him the destructive potential of modern warfare and the importance of coordinating infantry, artillery, and aviation, something the Japanese Army was only beginning to master. His rise continued when he entered the Army War College, graduating 6th in his class. This achievement opened the door to the assignment that would transform his military perspective, military attaché in Switzerland and Germany from 1919 to 1922. In Europe, he observed the consequences of the Treaty of Versailles and the German efforts to reorganize their army within imposed limitations. He was impressed by the Germans' ability to compensate for numerical restrictions through better training and innovative use of technology. He became fluent in German and established contacts that would be useful decades later. Returning to Japan in 1922, promoted to major, he was assigned to the Ministry of War. There he developed reform proposals based on what he had observed in Europe: a more efficient chain of command, airborne forces, modernization of military aviation, and better coordination between branches of the armed forces. These proposals encountered resistance. The Japanese army was divided into factions with different interpretations of the military's role in society. Yamashita aligned himself with the Kodoha or Imperial WWII faction, which advocated for a renewed army serving directly under the emperor. This position put him at odds with the Toseiha or control faction led by officers such as Hideki Tojo, who favored a more bureaucratic structure controlled from the Ministry of War. The rivalry with Tojo intensified during the 1930s. The two held incompatible visions for the direction of the Imperial Army. While Tojo consolidated political and bureaucratic power, Yamashita maintained his reputation as a tactical innovator, but distanced himself from the center of influence. The breaking point came on February 26, 1936, when young officers of the Kodoha attempted a coup, assassinating politicians and occupying government buildings. The uprising was crushed in 3 days, but Yamashita made a fatal mistake. He requested clemency for the rebel officers when Emperor Hirohito demanded harsh punishment. This request was interpreted as sympathy for the rebels. The result was devastating. He lost the emperor's trust and was branded as politically unreliable. As punishment, he was sent to Korea in a minor post, far from the center of power in Tokyo. During this exile, he took the opportunity to refine his skills as a field commander. In 1937, he was promoted to lieutenant general and given command of the 4th Infantry Division, participating in operations against Chinese insurgents. He demonstrated tactical capability, but also pragmatism. He publicly advocated that Japan should seek a negotiated solution to the Chinese conflict and maintain peaceful relations with the United States and Great Britain. These positions were systematically ignored. In 1940, drawing on his prior European experience, he was sent on a secret military mission to Germany and Italy. For 6 months, he studied German military techniques, especially the blitzkrieg that had proved so effective in Poland and France. He met with Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini, although his private impressions were less enthusiastic than the official reports. He privately remarked that Hitler might be a great speaker from a platform, but behind his desk he looked more like an office clerk than a visionary leader. What truly impressed him were the technical aspects of mechanized warfare, the coordination between tanks, aviation, and motorized infantry that allowed enemy lines to be broken and advances made with devastating speed. Upon returning to Japan in 1941, the situation had completely changed. The United States and the British Empire had imposed severe economic sanctions, cutting off supplies of oil and vital raw materials. The Japanese High Command had concluded that only military expansion into Southeast Asia could guarantee access to the resources needed for national survival. Despite his past differences with the political leadership, Yamashita was considered for an important role in the planned offensive. His tactical experience and knowledge of Western military techniques made him a natural candidate to command complex operations against well-equipped European forces. On November 6, 1941, he received the appointment that would define his place in history, commander of the Japanese 25th Army, tasked with the invasion of Malaya and the conquest of Singapore. It was his opportunity for redemption. A swift and decisive victory could rehabilitate his career and silence his political enemies. In the days leading up to the operation, he gathered his senior officers and laid out his strategic vision. The campaign had to be fast, bold, and psychologically devastating. They had neither time nor resources for a prolonged war. The only possibility for success lay in hitting hard, moving quickly, and maintaining the initiative to the end. Eastern Lightning, the offensive on Malaya. The Japanese attack on Malaya began on December 8, 1941, just 1 hour after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Yamashita had designed an operation that relied on speed and surprise to compensate for his numerical inferiority. His 30,000 men faced more than 140,000 Allied soldiers under the command of British General Arthur Percival. The strategy consisted of 3 simultaneous landings. The main one, apparently, would take place in Kota Baru on the northeast coast of Malaya. The more significant landings would be carried out in Singora and Patani, southern Thailand, allowing the attack on Malaya from the rear. The first moments were critical. In Kota Baru, the Indian 9th Division put up fierce resistance with machine gun and artillery fire. The Japanese landing barges suffered numerous casualties, and for several hours the landing was on the brink of failure. However, constant pressure and the arrival of reinforcements broke the British defenses. By midday, the Japanese had secured the beachhead. The first decisive factor was air supremacy. Japanese bombers systematically attacked British airfields, destroying most enemy aircraft on the ground. The few British fighters that took off, mostly obsolete Brewster Buffaloes, could not compete with the experienced Japanese pilots, veterans of China. The second factor was the most surprising tactical innovation, the massive use of bicycles. The Malay Peninsula was covered in dense jungle with few passable roads. Yamashita and his operations chief, Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, ordered the requisition of all available bicycles in the occupied areas. Thousands of soldiers advanced, pedaling along the narrow Malay roads, moving much faster than infantry on foot and without the need for scarce fuel. When the wheels broke, they continued pushing and using the frames as supports for equipment. This unexpected mobility completely confused the British. The advance was relentless. In Jitra, from December 11th to 13th, the Indian 11th Division tried to establish a solid defensive line but was overrun in 2 days. The disorganized retreat left large amounts of weapons and vehicles, which the Japanese immediately took advantage of. One of the few successful British defenses took place in Kampar between December 30th and January 2nd. Indian and British troops held out for several days on elevated positions, causing severe losses to the attackers. However, the risk of being surrounded by flanking maneuvers forced the evacuation of these positions as well. On December 10th, a disaster occurred that shattered British morale. The battleships HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse were sunk by Japanese bombers near the eastern coast. Force Z had been sent to intercept Japanese convoys, but sailing without air cover made it easy prey. The sinking demonstrated that British naval supremacy in the Pacific had ended. The Japanese could conduct minor amphibious landings behind British lines without opposition, forcing the defenders to retreat continuously. The speed of the advance was extraordinary. In 55 days, they covered more than 1,100 kilometers from Kota Baru to the southern tip of the peninsula. The Allies conducted a continuous retreat, demolishing bridges to slow the advance, but Japanese mobility overcame all obstacles. The soldiers crossed rivers on foot, carrying their bicycles, used secondary trails to flank defensive positions, and maintained a pace that prevented the British from consolidating new lines of resistance. The morale of the colonial troops collapsed in the face of an enemy that always seemed one step ahead. On January 31st, 1942, the last British troops crossed the Johor Strait to the island of Singapore, blowing up the bridge that connected it to the mainland. All defense was now reduced to the island fortress, defended by 85,000 demoralized soldiers against barely 30,000 Japanese. Singapore had been promoted as the Gibraltar of the East, an impregnable fortress. The port had large 381mm coastal guns and had been presented as the impenetrable bulwark of the empire in the Pacific. However, the land defenses were poorly organized. The large guns were aimed toward the sea with armor-piercing ammunition designed to sink ships, not to fight infantry. Yamashita established his headquarters in the Sultan of Johor's palace, from where he could directly observe the British defenses. Although his troops were at the limit of their supplies, he decided not to give the British time to reorganize. On February 8th, after a bombardment that lasted all day, the amphibious assault began. During the afternoon, 88,000 shells pounded British positions, destroying communications and sowing chaos. At dusk, the Japanese 18th Division and the Imperial Guards began crossing the strait in 150 barges. This area was defended by only 3,000 men of the Australian 22nd Brigade, completely outmatched. The Australians resisted with machine gun and mortar fire, but the pressure was relentless. In a few hours, multiple breaches were opened, and by dawn on February 9th, the Japanese had secured solid beachheads. In the following days, they systematically advanced toward the center of the island, capturing Bukit Timah with its vital ammunition and fuel depots. The loss of fresh water reservoirs brought Singapore to the brink of collapse. General Percival made the mistake of dispersing his forces to defend the entire perimeter instead of concentrating them at decisive points. He also delayed sending reinforcements to the threatened sectors, allowing the Japanese to consolidate their gains. On February 15th, with the situation unsustainable, Percival requested a meeting with Yamashita. The meeting took place at the Ford factory, converted into a Japanese headquarters. Yamashita, aware that his forces were also at their limit, used psychological intimidation to hasten the surrender. When Percival tried to negotiate conditions, Yamashita replied that he only wanted to hear a yes or a no to unconditional surrender. At 1810, on February 15th, Percival signed the surrender of Singapore, handing over 80,000 soldiers to an army 3 times smaller. Winston Churchill described the fall as the worst disaster and largest surrender in British military history. For the British Empire, it was a total humiliation. For Japan, an unprecedented propaganda triumph that demonstrated that European colonial powers could be defeated by an Asian country. The Japanese press immediately dubbed Yamashita with the title that would make him world famous. In just 10 weeks, with limited forces and facing a numerically superior enemy, he had led one of the fastest and most successful campaigns of the Second World War. Shadows of Blood, Singapore under extermination. The brilliant military victory came accompanied by atrocities that permanently stained Yamashita's reputation. While propaganda celebrated the conqueror of Singapore, the troops under his command perpetrated crimes that horrified even within the brutal context of the Second World War. The first episode occurred on February 14, 1942. The Alexandra Military Hospital, located in the southwest of Singapore, housed hundreds of wounded soldiers along with doctors, nurses, and medical staff. Red Cross flags clearly identified the facility as protected by international conventions. Around 1 in the afternoon, a Japanese detachment burst into the complex. A British lieutenant came out to meet them carrying a white flag but was immediately pierced with a bayonet. The Japanese soldiers entered the operating rooms where surgeons were working. Doctors were killed while operating. Patients on stretchers were stabbed with bayonets. Nurses executed alongside the wounded they were trying to protect. Testimonies indicate that at least 50 people died in this initial assault. The barbarity continued the next day. Approximately 200 people, including medical personnel and patients, were forced to march 400 meters to a factory. The wounded who could not keep pace were executed along the way. At the factory, the survivors were crammed into small rooms without ventilation or water. During the night, many died from suffocation and dehydration. The next morning, the Japanese methodically executed the survivors with bayonets. Only a few managed to survive by pretending to be dead. 4 days after the surrender, an even more devastating operation began. On February 18th, Japanese patrols accompanied by Kempeitai agents began moving through the Chinese neighborhoods of Singapore, ordering the male population to gather in squares and open fields. The operation was named Suk Ching, purification by cleansing in Chinese. Officially, it sought to eliminate hostile elements, communists, guerrillas, sympathizers of China. In practice, it was an indiscriminate ethnic purge against Singapore's Chinese population. The selection criteria were arbitrary and fatal. Men between 18 and 50 years old were separated from their families and subjected to superficial inspection. A suspicious look, an anonymous accusation, or simple bad luck resulted in immediate death sentence. Thousands were loaded onto trucks and transported to beaches and open fields turned into execution sites: Changi, Punggol, Katong, Siglap. There, under the tropical sun, the victims dug their own graves before being machine-gunned or individually executed by the sea. Survivor testimonies describe absolute horror. Men forced to stand all night before being executed at dawn. Sons killed in front of their fathers. Victims who tried to flee into the jungle only to be captured and executed on the spot. The massacre continued for more than 2 weeks until March 4, 1942. Estimates range between 25,000 and 50,000 victims. Entire Chinese communities were decimated. The city, renamed Shonan by the Japanese, was plunged into terror that would persist throughout the occupation. In addition to these emblematic episodes, Japanese troops committed numerous lesser atrocities. In Penang, after the British evacuation, they began systematic looting, mass rapes, and public executions of alleged collaborators. In rural villages of Johor and Perak, they applied collective punishments. If guerrilla activity was suspected, houses were burned and inhabitants shot indiscriminately. Numerous Allied prisoners of war captured during the campaign were summarily executed instead of being transferred to camps as required by the conventions. These scattered crimes created a reputation for ferocity that would follow the Japanese army throughout its expansion in Southeast Asia. The central historical question is to what extent Yamashita was personally responsible. The evidence is contradictory and has generated decades of debate. Some documents suggest that the massacres were the result of orders transmitted from his headquarters. Testimonies indicate that his staff officers explicitly discussed the need to eliminate anti-Japanese elements before consolidating the occupation. The systematic nature of Suk Ching, with coordination between different units and participation of the Kempeitai, suggests centralized planning that could hardly be executed without the Supreme Commander's knowledge. The magnitude of the operation, with tens of thousands gathered in open fields and transported over days, was impossible to conceal. On the other hand, there is documentation proving that Yamashita issued specific orders prohibiting looting, rape, and gratuitous violence. His instructions included, "Do not steal, do not burn, do not rape," warning that violators would be severely punished. In several documented cases, he effectively punished soldiers caught committing excesses. Defenders argue that it was impossible for him to control every action of 30,000 soldiers dispersed during an intense campaign. The brutality of Japanese troops, fueled by years of militarist indoctrination and contempt for conquered peoples, had spiraled out of control. Critics respond that a supreme commander could not ignore atrocities of such magnitude. A general's responsibility includes not only directing military operations, but ensuring that his troops respect the laws of war. The evidence suggests that some subordinates acted on their own initiative, interpreting general pacification orders in an extremely brutal way. Japanese military culture emphasized anticipating the superior's desires and acting with aggressive spirit, which could lead to excesses not specifically ordered, but also not explicitly prohibited. The atrocities established a pattern that would be repeated in other Southeast Asian conquests. For the victims and their descendants, the debate over personal responsibility is academic. What mattered was that under his command, some of the worst crimes of the war were perpetrated. His name became associated not only with tactical genius, but with the blood of tens of thousands of innocents. Tropical Hell, the tragedy of Manila. In July 1942, at the height of his glory as the conqueror of Singapore, Yamashita was suddenly removed from his command and sent to distant Manchukuo. This decision was the work of Tojo, who by then had consolidated his position as prime minister. Jealous of his rival's growing prestige, he had maneuvered to neutralize a politically dangerous competitor. Yamashita spent the next 2 years in a golden exile, commanding important forces but far removed from the main operations in the Pacific. By 1944, the situation had changed completely. The American offensive had captured the Marianas, placing all of Japan within reach of B-29 bombers. In the South Pacific, MacArthur was preparing to fulfill his promise to return to the Philippines. The fall of Tojo's cabinet in July after the loss of the Marianas opened an unexpected opportunity. The new leadership desperately needed competent commanders to defend critical positions. On September 26, 1944, Yamashita received the appointment that would change the final course of his life: commander of the 14th Area Army and military governor of the Philippines. He arrived in Manila on October 10th to assume control of approximately 262,000 soldiers scattered across the archipelago. His situation was precarious from the outset. The Imperial Navy had lost control of the seas, supplies from Japan were practically non-existent, and many troops were poorly equipped second-line units. Aware of the overwhelming American superiority, he dismissed any coastal defense strategy. He designed a plan of deep resistance based on 3 defensive groups. The Shobu Group, under his direct command, would defend northern Luzon with 152,000 men. The Kembu Group would protect Bataan with 30,000. The Shimbu Group would defend southern Luzon and Manila with 80,000. The strategy consisted of retreating to fortified mountainous positions, forcing the Americans to fight in difficult terrain, and prolonging resistance to inflict significant casualties. He knew he could not win, but believed that a high cost in American lives might generate pressure for a negotiated peace. A crucial decision was the evacuation of Manila. Yamashita ordered that the capital be declared an open city, free of combat to preserve infrastructure and civilian lives. Army troops were to withdraw to the mountains, leaving only a minimal detachment to maintain order until the Americans arrived. This order was not respected by all. Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi, commanding approximately 16,000 Marines, refused to evacuate the capital. Iwabuchi had lost his flagship at Guadalcanal and sought to redeem his honor through a suicidal defense of Manila. Against Yamashita's direct orders, Iwabuchi fortified key buildings, especially in Intramuros and the port area. His men dug tunnels, placed mines, and prepared urban positions designed to cause maximum damage to attackers. On October 20th, MacArthur launched his campaign with the landing in Leyte. Resistance was limited, and by December the entire island was under American control. On January 9, 1945, the 6th Army landed at Lingayen, Luzon, beginning the final phase of the Philippine reconquest. American forces advanced rapidly toward Manila, overcoming organized resistance. By February 3rd, elements of the 1st Cavalry Division had reached the northern suburbs of the capital, expecting to find an evacuated city. Instead, they found an urban hell. Iwabuchi's troops had turned Manila into a fortress, using every building, street, and tunnel as a defensive position. The ensuing battle was one of the most brutal in the Pacific. The Japanese Marines, with no chance of escape or reinforcements, fought with the desperation of the doomed. They used heavy naval artillery, anti-aircraft guns, and automatic weapons to defend each block. The Americans advanced house to house using flamethrowers, explosives, and artillery to dislodge the defenders. But the most horrific aspect was not the combat between soldiers, but the deliberate campaign of terror against the Filipino civilian population. As they retreated, Iwabuchi's men unleashed their hatred on the defenseless inhabitants. The atrocities began immediately. Families were locked in houses and burned alive. Women and girls were mass raped, many murdered afterward. Nuns and priests were executed in churches and convents. Children were used for bayonet practice or thrown into the air to be impaled. In Intramuros, more than 4,000 people were massacred in a few days. The Japanese gathered civilians in plazas and public buildings supposedly for protection, then executed them with machine guns, grenades, or burned them with gasoline. Testimonies describe unimaginable horror. Mothers forced to witness their children's deaths, elderly tortured for amusement, babies thrown against walls, collective rapes followed by mutilations and killings. The battle lasted exactly 1 month, from February 3rd to March 3rd, 1945. The Japanese were completely annihilated, including Iwabuchi himself, who committed suicide to avoid capture. The cost was appalling. More than 100,000 Filipino civilians died during the fighting. The physical destruction was nearly total. Manila, known as the Pearl of the Orient for its architectural beauty, was reduced to smoldering ruins. Only Warsaw had suffered comparable devastation during the entire war. While Manila burned, other atrocities were being committed in different parts of the archipelago. In Palawan, on December 14, 1944, the Puerto Princesa massacre took place, where 150 American prisoners were brutally murdered. Faced with the advance of rescue forces, local commanders decided to eliminate all prisoners. The Americans were forced into trenches dug as supposed air raid shelters. Once inside, the Japanese poured gasoline and set them on fire. Prisoners who tried to escape engulfed in flames were machine-gunned. Others tried to climb a nearby cliff but were hunted down and executed. Only 11 men managed to escape and report the atrocity. The remaining 139 perished in that hell. In addition to these main episodes, numerous lesser atrocities were documented. Mass executions of suspected guerrillas and villagers, forced marches where weakened prisoners were abandoned to die, systematic use of civilian human shields. Throughout this period, Yamashita remained in the mountains of northern Luzon, directing the resistance of his increasingly reduced troops. His war of attrition strategy worked partially. American forces suffered significant casualties in mountainous combat, and the campaign lasted much longer than expected. When Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, Yamashita still commanded about 50,000 emaciated survivors out of the original 260,000. On September 2nd, the same day the surrender was signed in Tokyo, he surrendered to American authorities in Kiangan. The Philippine campaign had ended, but its consequences were just beginning. The atrocities committed under Yamashita's command demanded justice, and the victors were determined to establish legal precedents to ensure such crimes would not go unpunished. Relentless verdict, the Yamashita Doctrine. On October 29, 1945, barely 2 months after the Japanese surrender, one of the most important post-war trials opened in Manila. In the building of the School of Fine Arts of the University of the Philippines, a U.S. military tribunal prepared to try Yamashita for war crimes committed during the Philippine campaign. The trial would establish a revolutionary legal precedent, determining whether a military commander could be held criminally responsible for crimes committed by his subordinates, even without direct evidence of specific orders. The tribunal was composed of 5 American generals appointed by MacArthur. General Russell Reynolds presided over the court, while the prosecution was led by Colonel Frank Reel and Major Robert Kehoe. The defense was assigned to Colonel Harry Clark and Major Robert Chandler, competent officers facing a virtually impossible task. The charges were devastatingly simple, allowing troops under his command to commit massive war crimes against civilians and prisoners in the Philippines, and failing in his duty as a commander to control subordinates and ensure compliance with the laws of war. The prosecution did not attempt to prove that Yamashita had directly ordered the massacres in Manila or Puerto Princesa. Its thesis was more subtle but equally lethal. As commander-in-chief, he had the obligation to prevent such atrocities or punish those responsible, and his failure made him criminally liable. For 6 weeks, the tribunal heard chilling testimonies. Filipino survivors recounted how Japanese soldiers entered their homes, killed the men, raped the women, and threw children into burning buildings. Catholic clergy described the systematic execution of nuns, priests, and worshippers in churches turned into slaughterhouses. The survivors of Puerto Princesa recounted how they had been thrown into burning trenches while their comrades burned under Japanese machine guns. Doctors and nurses testified about hospitals deliberately attacked, with wounded patients killed in their beds during medical treatment. Each testimony added another layer of horror to the picture of systematic brutality. The prosecution used this accumulation to argue that the scale of the crimes was such that Yamashita could not have been unaware of what was happening under his command. The defense built a strategy based on several key arguments. First, lack of direct knowledge. Yamashita claimed he had never been informed of the atrocities in Manila because his orders had been to evacuate the city explicitly. It was Iwabuchi who disobeyed, turning the capital into a battlefield against the Supreme Command's instructions. Second, material impossibility of control. Yamashita commanded more than 260,000 men scattered across thousands of islands, with communications disrupted by American air superiority. No commander could personally supervise every action of every soldier under such extreme circumstances. Third, absence of direct evidence. There was no written document, recorded verbal order, or direct testimony showing that Yamashita ordered or authorized the massacres of civilians or prisoners. Yamashita testified before the court with dignity that impressed even his accusers. His words became a classic defense. "My command was as large as that of General MacArthur or Lord Mountbatten. How could I know if some of my soldiers behaved badly? If I had known of these acts, I would have punished them severely. What I am really accused of is having lost the war." The defense attempted to introduce documents proving that Yamashita had issued specific orders prohibiting looting, rape, and violence against civilians. It also sought to call high-ranking Japanese witnesses who could have confirmed Iwabuchi's disobedience and the impossibility of effective communication. However, the court systematically rejected most of this favorable evidence. It refused to admit testimony from Japanese officers, dismissed documents demonstrating orders to protect civilians, and severely limited the defense's ability to present its full case. This partial attitude reinforced the perception that the verdict was predetermined. The trial seemed designed more to set an exemplary precedent than to determine individual guilt based on specific evidence. On December 7, 1945, exactly 4 years after Pearl Harbor, the military tribunal found Yamashita guilty on all counts. The ruling established the principle that a military commander can be held responsible not only for the orders he gives, but also for the crimes he fails to prevent or adequately punish. The sentence was death by hanging. The legal precedent established would become known as the Yamashita Standard or Command Responsibility Doctrine, a principle that would permanently transform international humanitarian law. The lawyers immediately appealed, arguing that the trial had violated fundamental principles of due process. The case reached the U.S. Supreme Court under In re Yamashita, becoming one of the most controversial in American military jurisprudence. On February 4, 1946, by a narrow 5-2 majority, the Supreme Court upheld the sentence. The majority opinion held that in times of war, military tribunals had wide discretion and that a commander's responsibility for the actions of his troops was absolute. 2 justices issued devastatingly critical dissenting opinions. Frank Murphy wrote that the procedure constituted a denial of due process, while Wiley Rutledge declared, "To condemn a man to death without direct evidence of personal guilt is contrary to the principles of justice we profess to defend." These dissents remained as testimony to fundamental legal doubts, but they did not change the accused's fate. The machinery of military justice proceeded inexorably toward execution. The precedent extended far beyond its original context. The doctrine of command responsibility became a cornerstone of international criminal law, later applied in the Tokyo trials, proceedings for crimes in Vietnam, Rwanda, Yugoslavia, and finally codified in the statutes of the International Criminal Court. The historical paradox is remarkable. A trial considered by many experts as rushed and legally deficient gave rise to one of the most solid principles of modern war law. Command responsibility became an international norm. No military leader can claim ignorance of the systematic crimes of their troops. However, the debate over the fairness of the original process persists. For some historians and jurists, it represented a necessary act of exemplary justice that established crucial standards. For others, it was victor's justice that sacrificed fundamental legal guarantees in favor of political convenience and vengeance. The controversy deepens when considering that Allied commanders who oversaw massive bombings of civilian cities were never similarly accused. The selective application of the principle suggests that political factors influenced as much as pure legal considerations. Regardless of these controversies, the case marked a turning point in the evolution of international law. For the first time in history, a court clearly affirmed that military authority entails inescapable legal responsibility for the conduct of subordinate troops. Commanders could no longer turn a blind eye to their men's crimes and expect impunity. The gallows of Los Baños, the execution of a general. In the early hours of February 23, 1946, as the tropical darkness began to yield to dawn, the silence of the Los Baños prison camp was broken by the metallic sound of bolts sliding open. The moment had come for Tomoyuki Yamashita, once celebrated as the conqueror of Singapore and now awaiting death as a convicted war criminal. The Los Baños prison, located 30 kilometers south of Manila, was housed in a former agricultural university complex. Its facilities had been converted into a detention center for Japanese war criminals and would now host the final act in the life of the most controversial general of the empire. Yamashita had spent his last night with a calmness that surprised his American guards. They reported he had prayed softly, groomed himself meticulously, and written final notes. There were no desperate pleas, tears, or emotional breakdowns, only a stoic silence reflective of decades of Japanese military discipline. At 6 a.m., 2 American soldiers opened his cell. Yamashita stood up immediately, wearing his now worn khaki Japanese general's uniform, stripped of all rank insignia. His appearance reflected months of deprivation. He had lost considerable weight, yet still maintained the upright bearing of his military career. The guards escorted him to the prison's central courtyard, where a freshly built wooden gallows awaited. The structure was sober and utilitarian, an elevated platform accessed by 13 wooden steps, with a trapdoor in the center and the executioner's rope hanging off to one side. The short walk from the cell to the scaffold was laden with historical symbolism. Behind him walked high-ranking American officers, select journalists and official witnesses, including Colonel Clark, who had defended him at trial. Observers noted that Yamashita kept his head high throughout, showing no visible signs of fear or despair. At the base of the stairs, an American officer asked if he wished to say any final words. The interpreter translated the question, and Yamashita nodded. With a firm, clear voice, he addressed those present in Japanese while the interpreter simultaneously translated, "As I said in the Supreme Court of Manila, I did my utmost, and so I do not feel ashamed before the gods for what I have done when I die. But if it is said that I had no ability to command the Japanese army, I cannot deny it, for that is my nature. Now, our trial for war crimes proceeds under your kindness and justice. I know that all of you Americans and U.S. military affairs have always shown tolerant and fair judgment." He continued, "When I was investigated in the Manila court, I received good treatment and kind conduct from your officers of good character who protected me at all times. I will never forget what they did for me, even after death. I do not blame my executioner. I will pray for the gods to bless him. Please convey my words of gratitude to Colonel Clark and Lieutenant Colonels Feldhaus and Hendricks, Major Guy, Captains Sandberg and Reel from the Manila court, and Colonel Arnad. Thank you." What stood out most in this final statement was the complete absence of hatred or bitterness. Instead of cursing his enemies or protesting perceived injustice, Yamashita chose to thank those who had treated him with humanity during his trial and captivity, even asking blessings for the man who would execute him. After finishing his speech, he slowly climbed the 13 steps of the gallows. Each step echoed on the wooden boards in the morning stillness as the small audience observed in solemn silence. There were no shouting crowds or lynch mob atmosphere, just a select group witnessing the end of a complex historical figure. The executioner, a U.S. Army sergeant trained in military executions, waited on the platform with preparations complete. 2 guards helped Yamashita stand exactly over the trapdoor, then tied his legs and arms to prevent involuntary movements that could complicate the hanging. They placed a black hood over his head, cutting off his final view of the outside world. Finally, the executioner carefully positioned the noose around his neck, placing the knot to the left according to standard protocols to ensure a quick death by cervical dislocation. At 6:19 a.m., the commanding officer gave the final order. The executioner pulled the lever, and the trapdoor opened with a sharp, decisive sound. Yamashita's body dropped through the opening and the rope snapped taut with an audible crack. The impact was reportedly instantaneous. Witnesses observed no prolonged spasms or signs of extended suffering. Death came swiftly as the mechanism was designed to deliver. The attending military doctor officially confirmed death minutes later. The body was lowered gently and placed in a simple wooden coffin prepared in advance. He was initially buried in the prison camp cemetery, though in 1959 his remains were transferred to Japan. News of the execution spread worldwide within hours. In the Philippines, many received it as a necessary act of justice for the Manila massacre. For survivors of Japanese atrocities, seeing the Supreme Commander executed was a powerful symbol of moral reparation. In the United States, the media presented the execution as confirmation that those responsible for mass atrocities would inevitably be punished. Newspapers highlighted Yamashita's dignified demeanor in facing his final fate. In Japan, the reaction was far more complex and ambivalent. Some saw him as an unjustly executed martyr, the victim of a vengeful trial. Others viewed him as a defeated military hero who maintained honor until the end, without necessarily deeming him innocent. The execution cemented his status as one of the most controversial figures of Japan's Second World War. His legacy remains split between two irreconcilable images: the brilliant strategist who humiliated the British Empire in Singapore and the commander under whose watch some of the war's worst atrocities occurred. Beyond the immediate reactions, Yamashita's death had long-lasting legal consequences that reached far beyond his individual case. The legal precedent set by his trial and execution transformed modern international criminal law. This principle has since been applied in numerous war crimes and crimes against humanity cases. It was used in the Tokyo trials during the Malaya proceedings in Vietnam, in international tribunals for Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia, and ultimately codified in the statutes of the International Criminal Court in The Hague. Yamashita's lifeless body hanging at Los Baños became the symbolic foundation of a new international legal order. The doctrine established that no military leader can plead ignorance of systematic crimes by their troops, and that command entails an inescapable legal obligation to prevent and punish atrocities. Yet the debate over the justice of his execution continues to divide historians and international law experts. Critics argue that he was condemned for crimes he did not directly order, based on a command responsibility standard that had no clear precedent at the time. Supporters counter that the scale of atrocities under his command demanded exemplary punishment and the creation of new legal norms. This controversy deepens when noting that Allied commanders responsible for bombing civilian cities or allowing atrocities against Axis prisoners were never similarly charged. The selective application of the principle suggests that political and vengeful motives influenced the process as much as legal reasoning. In the years following his death, theories emerged about hidden motivations behind his execution. Some researchers suggested the hasty trial may have been linked to Yamashita's knowledge of massive amounts of gold looted by the Japanese army across Asia. According to these theories, his death permanently silenced one of the few men who knew the location of treasure worth billions. In 1971, a Filipino treasure hunter named Rogelio Roxas claimed to have found a cave filled with gold bars and a solid gold Buddha statue. Roxas alleged this treasure was part of the infamous Yamashita gold, but he was arrested by Ferdinand Marcos's regime and tortured to reveal the exact location. After Marcos's fall in 1986, Roxas's family sued the dictator's heirs in U.S. courts. In 1998, a Hawaiian court ruled in Roxas's favor, ordering the Marcos family to pay $19 million in damages, although both Marcos and Roxas had already died. These theories remain in the realm of speculation, but they illustrate how Yamashita's figure continued to inspire mystery and controversy decades after his death. What is indisputable is that his execution set legal precedents that have influenced international law for over 70 years. In Japan, Yamashita's memory remains complex and divisive. His name appears in the Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo, dedicated to those who died in service of the emperor, but he is rarely mentioned in official ceremonies. Nationalists remember him as an unjustly executed military hero, while more moderate voices acknowledge the atrocities committed under his command. In the Philippines, he is remembered mainly as a symbol of the brutality of the Japanese occupation. Textbooks present him as responsible for the Manila massacre, and survivors and their descendants continue to preserve the memory of the suffering endured under his command. In Singapore and Malaysia, the view is similar. While his tactical brilliance in the 1942 campaign is acknowledged, his legacy is irreparably stained by the Suk Ching and Alexandra Hospital massacres. Monuments and museums in these countries include those crimes as an integral part of their national historical narratives. In the West, Yamashita is studied primarily in academic contexts as an example of the moral and legal complexities of modern warfare. His case is taught in military academies and law schools as an illustration of both tactical brilliance and the consequences of command responsibility. The central paradox of his legacy remains unresolved. He was simultaneously one of the most successful commanders of World War II and the ultimate authority responsible for some of its worst atrocities. This duality reflects broader contradictions about the nature of war, military honor, and morality in extreme conflict. His story illustrates how individuals can become trapped between national loyalty, military effectiveness, and basic humanity. Yamashita served his emperor and country faithfully, demonstrated exceptional tactical skill, but also presided over crimes that violated the core principles of civilization. The debate over his personal guilt will continue as long as historians remain interested in World War II. Some will argue that he was a victim of unjust trial, sacrificed for the political need to symbolically punish Japanese war crimes. Others will maintain that he deserved his fate as a commander who allowed or failed to prevent mass atrocities.